how to address individual needs in their community. And we have 13 of those in the state, and you can see them on that chart. In February, we finished almost a year-long process to revise our state strategic plan. And that's online at the what's that called? Web address below. And so we have direction now. We have a really strong plan to address homelessness throughout the state. And we have one of our managers in our office that's working very hard on this now to get our local homeless council strategic plans aligned with the state strategic plan. And we're all wanting to work on the same page, working together in the same direction. That will make a lot of difference. You can see the goals that we have there. They have to do with housing. It has to do with services. It has to do with prevention. If we can go upstream and turn off the taps, that would be a really good thing. And then, of course, coordination is part of our plan. We also completed our annual report. Was made public in June. It addresses the system performance measures, the housing inventory count, and the point-in-time count. I'm going to just go over a couple highlights because this, the data that's in the homeless report there is really, it's a data-rich report and kind of gives a really good overview of what the homeless situation is in Utah. So first of all, we had an increase in the number of first-time people experiencing homelessness for the first time, a 10% increase. Last year it was 14%, but that's 8,637 people that experienced homelessness for the first time. We had our shelter days. That's how long people spend in shelters, actually reduced by 2 days, which is a good thing, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then we like to always highlight here, one of the most important things is housing. It is the antithesis of homelessness. And once we get people into housing, 93% of those individuals stay in that housing a year or more. And that's very important in what, as I talk about housing as one of the most important things in solving homelessness. So this is the point-in-time count. Every year, HUD requires every area to do a count of those who are experiencing homelessness. That's in shelters and the unsheltered. And our count this year is up 3.7% from the previous year to 3,687. That's done in January, and it's done statewide, so that's a statewide number. Now, in the point-in-time count, we've got a lot of interesting data. This is broken out by subpopulation. So you'll notice adults with mental illness or adults with substance abuse disorders has increased substantially over the last year. Now, we don't know exactly why that is, but we are seeing more mental health events and more substance abuse events in the homeless population. And here's one that is alarming for us. The chronic homeless. We're seeing that has increased 96% over the last 4 years since 2019. This is also very interesting because this kind of tells us what the problem is. From 2012 to 2017, we added 804 beds, deeply affordable, supportive housing into the system. Chronic homelessness was not running, wasn't running huge increases like we've had the last couple of years. But then we stopped. creating that type of housing. So if you look at now 2019 to 23, we only added 45 beds during that time. It's little wonder why we're seeing chronic homelessness increase. People need a place to be able to stabilize, to feel safe in order to deal with, whatever they're dealing with in their life. And so that's an important element we need to know, and this data actually tells us what we need to do. Housing is in the middle of that. So I think in my slides, I'm going to tell you this right now because it may be in my slides a little further. So to kind of tell you how important housing is, or another data point to emphasize housing, is HUD also does, or somebody takes all the HUD data, and we do a homeless rate in every state. And it's so many people per 10,000. Which do you think is the highest state? Which state has the highest rate? California. Yeah, they're right at the top, 44 per 10,000. Which do you think is the lowest state? And Representative Walter can't answer this because he was in the meeting yesterday. I do remember. What? Alaska? Good. Alaska, I think, is probably 13 or something like that, if I remember right. It's Mississippi. And that's a surprise to a lot of folks. 4 per 10,000. California, 44. Mississippi, 4 per 10,000. Now overlay that with the cost of housing. Where is housing the least expensive? Mississippi. Where is it the most expensive? California. So there's a direct relationship with the cost of housing and the rate of homelessness. We just want to show, and some of this information I'm not going to go through in detail, but we leave our presentation with staff, and anytime you need to review this information or if you have any questions, please reach out to us. But this is what we've been funded, and where we go through competitive grant processes, both for the housing money that we receive and for the provider money that we receive. We sign contracts with those providers for those people that provide housing. There's deed restrictions for the housing. It has to be 30% AMI and below. We're trying to use these precious taxpayer dollars as efficiently as possible, getting the most out of those dollars as possible, leveraging those dollars as much as possible. Just giving an indication where where our funds go, or where the funds come from: federal, state, local funds. Now, local funds, that is what we call mitigation fund. So we passed some legislature back when I was there in the legislature, I think it was 2018, capturing some of the sales tax distribution from cities who don't have shelters and giving it to cities who do have shelters to help mitigate the impact of a shelter. I wanted to break down this so that you can see where the one-time money's going and where the ongoing. So housing is our biggest, where we spend most of our money for housing. Those are the grants that we give to housing developers, to housing authorities. Here's where the ongoing money will go for services, housing, and mitigation, because the state also contributes to the mitigation fund. These are the cities that received mitigation funds this last year. That's the amounts. Now the grants, well, let me just talk, we'll go into the housing grants. There's a national organization that I've watched now for probably since I've been in this position. and they do a study about the gaps of affordable housing in states. And they were showing that Utah had a deficit of 46,000 units. And I thought, wow, that sounds really high. Being a housing person myself, that's been where I've worked most of my life, is in housing and real estate development. So I reached out to Natalie Gochner and said, is that right? Well, you folks here in the legislature authorized a study to study that this year, and they've just finished their study. They're wrapping up. It will be official here this fall. But it's 77,000 units that we're short. I thought 46 was high, but they did an extensive study, and we're going to now have some really good data on housing to help inform policy. This is just a chart we threw in there about the difference between fair market rent. It's not really fair market rent. This is the HUD's fair market rent, so it's a little bit lower. But the difference between 30% area median income rent versus fair market rent, and the gaps of what rents need to be in order for somebody in that AMI to be able to afford housing. This is that I mentioned just a little while ago about the rate of homelessness. And I've looked at this really extensively. And the Midwest and the South are the lowest rates per home for homelessness. But those are the places where housing's the most affordable. West Coast, East Coast, they're all going to be higher because housing is more expensive. And we're 11 per 10,000, by the way. This is the housing model. So I'm a real estate developer. When I got into this, I recognized that housing was a huge element to any kind of success we were going to have with homelessness. And we're not talking about putting people in a market rate. There's so many people today that can't even begin to start to get into market rate. We've got to look at deeply affordable. Workforce service or workforce housing is 50 to 60% AMI. So how are we going to do this, and how are we going to fund it? When I was Senate President, I put together with the Speaker 6 budgets. I was in that position for 6 years. We are heavily involved, especially me, because I'm kind of a numbers wonk to start with. I dug deep into those budgets, and we put together those budgets. And so I'm always thinking, how am I going to fund this? Where's the money going to come from? And let's utilize some of the buckets we already have. Low-income housing tax credit, Medicaid, if we get that set up right, will help fund treatment, and will reduce the amount of the cost of support services that we need to come to the legislature for. But I have to tell you that what I've learned in this is the support services go with the housing. We can't just take people with behavioral and mental health issues and just put them in housing. There has to be support around that, or the housing has a higher chance of not being successful for that individual. So it's support and it's housing, and that all costs money. Low-income housing tax credit can pay for up to 65% of the cost of that housing. There would still be some gaps, so we need the one-time funds. That's our deeply affordable housing grants. We got $50 million out of the legislature this last year. And then low-income housing tax credit, we created the Utah low-income housing tax credit. Well, we didn't create it, but we added more money, a substantial amount this year. So that's now $10 million annually. And then in order to stabilize some of these housing projects, you got to have support for rent, a voucher, so to speak. So the legislature gave our office $5 million to test that model out. I know it needs to happen that way because I know what the levers are to make housing work. When I started to look at the pro formas for these projects, I thought, this will never attract capital. it will never naturally happen because it doesn't pencil. It doesn't even come close to penciling. So the reason why we don't have more deeply affordable housing, it'll never naturally happen. In 2022, we got $55 million. We went through our grant process. That will create, or it did begin to create, a number of housing units. Income restricted, almost 1,200, that $55 million through our grant process. That's the list of projects throughout the state. We're the State Office of Homeless Services, and we want to make sure this is spread throughout the state. This year's deeply affordable housing, we're going to be distributing 47, almost $48 million. We received requests for 105. We have not awarded those yet, but we'll be awarding those on Thursday at our council meeting. So that's just finishing up. Another successful round of grants, though. It'll make a lot of difference for homelessness and for those who just can't, are in that 30% AMI. Our attainable housing grants, we didn't receive as many requests as we would like to. I think it probably came too fast. I know it's what's needed, so we'll be working with Utah Housing Corporation and we'll be working with other developers, housing authorities, to educate them so that when we do another round of grants, that we'll be able to commit all those funds. I think that's, it's where we have our gaps now, though, is our office went to Reno to see their, we've been to Texas, to Austin, San Antonio. We've been to Dade County. We'll talk a little bit about that here, or Gene will talk more about that, the sequential intercept model. And one of the things that I see in all these areas, especially where we were at Washoe County and Reno here in March, they pay their caseworkers $32 an hour. It makes a lot of difference for them. We're averaging about $24 an hour, or probably even under that. So the gaps that we're dealing with, you saw the gaps, 77,000 units of deeply affordable housing that will never naturally happen. That's a big gap. We need the services so that we can deal with the issues that people experiencing homelessness face. And then, of course, to have those services, we've got to have people to be able to perform those. So those are the gaps that we are seeing. Happy to take some questions now, or we can do it at the end. But I'm going to turn the time over to Gene Hill now.
Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jean Hill with Salt Lake County Office of Homelessness and Criminal Justice Reform. And as Wayne mentioned, we did a number of different entities, including some legislators like Representative Briscoe, Senator Weiler, Senator Pitcher, county, city, state, business leaders, and others did travel to Miami-Dade County to see what they were doing, because despite their population, which is pretty much in that county the size of Utah, they're about 3.3 million population, their homeless population is incredibly small comparatively. So we have been looking into how do we replicate that kind of a model in Salt Lake County. We already actually have this model in place. It won't surprise you, I think, to know that Salt Lake County has the highest homeless population in the state. We also have the vast majority of services for homeless individuals across the state. But what we're really trying to do with this model is capture especially those folks who are caught in homelessness and then jail, and then they have unaddressed mental health and substance use disorder needs. So they're not able to get out of that cycle of homelessness. They're not able to get out of the cycle of criminal justice involvement because we're not getting them housed and we're not getting them the treatment services that they need. So the sequential intercept model is basically looking at the different pieces of our criminal justice system, our homelessness system, our behavioral health systems, and where do we divert people out of those systems? Which intercepts can we get to people quickest and most effectively to move them out. So obviously we want to get them, if you look at the chart, at intercept 0. If we can get them at the community level, they don't go out into the criminal justice system. We keep people from being victimized. We also address the needs of individuals early on so that they're more successful, and hopefully we don't see them repeating cycles of criminal justice involvement and homelessness. So this is a strategic planning tool. It maps the resources across each of these intercepts, and then we try and figure out how do we get people flowing through these intercepts and out of them in a more permanent way. And again, we want to divert as many people as possible at intercept 0. Why this intercept model? Because everybody benefits. The individuals we are serving benefit because they're getting more effective treatment at the right time, at the right place, rather than being forced to undergo treatment, which we know when we force somebody, for example, to get substance use treatment in jail or prison, once they get out, if that wasn't their choice, they're more likely to go right back into the substance use or, have that mental health not addressed, especially if they go into homelessness and really can't figure out a way to get those needs met. So better long-term success for individuals. We also reduce what we see currently now, which is, if at our HRCs, for example, in the middle of the night, if someone has a suicidal moment, 911 is called, and that person goes to an emergency room. That person doesn't necessarily have a physical health need. They have a mental health need that the emergency department cannot address. So we're taking them through the most expensive health systems for issues that really shouldn't be addressed in that system. So we're really trying to get people, again, to the right treatment in the right place. We want to reduce calls to law enforcement for homelessness crimes. Let's reserve our law enforcement officers for the real needs, violent crimes, regularly occurring crimes, not for the person who is yelling at individuals on the street, which is scary. Not to say it's not a scary situation, but that person doesn't need a law enforcement officer. They need someone to intervene and get them into mental health treatment. So we want to make sure that law enforcement is able to focus on the crimes where we really want law enforcement to focus. We want to reduce the use of our jails as the provider for mental health treatment and substance use treatment for individuals living in poverty. It's not an effective place for treatment. It's not the best use of our jail system, and we have far better outcomes for individuals when we actually treat them outside of our jail system. And there are lots of studies to show when you put a low-risk offender with high needs into criminal justice incarceration, they're likely to become high-risk, high-needs individuals because it is not the appropriate environment for them to be treated for those mental health and substance use issues. We want to improve our caseloads in the courts by resolving cases through diversion so they're not overwhelmed with a whole bunch of warrants from somebody who keeps getting picked up for loitering because they aren't getting out of homelessness and they're clogging the system. So let's put folks into the court system who need to be adjudicated, not folks who have a serious mental illness that needs to be addressed. And for our providers, what we really want to do is make sure we are building our data-informed coordination so we can track individuals through these systems and know where they're at and where they may have fallen through and get them back on track and out of the system by knowing this individual is living here and being treated here and they've been picked up by the officer here and he knows I need to take him back to treatment here rather than to jail. So it's a more effective use of all of our resources. This is a bare bones map of our Salt Lake County sequential intercepts. This is not by any means meant to be a comprehensive list, but we have in place all of the pieces that Miami-Dade County has in place in their very successful sequential intercept model. And I won't go through all of these. It is just to show we have all of the pieces. There are some key components, however, that we are missing. Some of the things that we're seeing in Miami-Dade that we do not have yet in Salt Lake County or in the state of Utah, number one, a sustainable funding source. Miami-Dade has put into place, they have a $65 million homeless trust fund. That money is available for homeless services only. That comes from federal grants, some state funding, and a local option tax on restaurants and bars, which works for Miami-Dade County, probably not the best tax for us. But for them, it brings in $30 million a year. And it is guaranteed funding for their system every single year. They also have one of the key things we're lacking, as Wayne mentioned, with housing. They have sufficient housing, sufficient services to address their population. Now, granted, they've built this system over 23 years. We are not that far behind. We've been building, as you saw in Wayne's slides, we had a great growth in permanent supportive housing for a while. So we know how to do this. We have to make sure that our system has the capacity it needs to address the individuals we're seeing. They also have a little different legal structure that does allow for involuntary commitment of individuals for diagnosis and treatment for a longer time period than we have. That's a piece that is up for debate, lots of debate, but it is one of the pieces that they have that we are missing. A piece that we do have is we are moving towards more person-centered programming to make sure people have peer supporters to navigate these complicated systems with them. When we are looking at a criminal justice system and a homeless services system and a behavioral health system, these are not necessarily user-friendly systems. They're very complicated. There's complicated paperwork. There's all kinds of things for someone who is in crisis to have to try and figure out. So you have to meet with your probation officer, get to your drug treatment appointment, get to your mental health appointment, find housing, get a job, get food, get transportation, and you're living on the street. It's not a system that is setting people up for success. So we want to at least offer folks a peer navigator who will help them walk through all of these complicated systems so that they don't fall into those cracks because they're just simply overwhelmed and do not have the capacity to deal with all of these complexities in their life because they're in constant crisis. The Miami-Dade model, our model, is rooted in an understanding that mental illnesses are diseases with symptoms and circumstances that lead to criminal consequences. The folks we are talking about are not hardened criminals. The hardened criminals are the ones we want in our jails, we want our law enforcement addressing. These are folks who have untreated mental disorders, who have untreated substance use disorders, who, if we can get them into treatment and housing, will end those cycles of criminal involvement. And we want consistent trauma-informed training for all of our partners. The vast majority of our partners are engaged in that kind of training. It's just, again, building capacity to continue the training. So really the difference between us and Miami-Dade's very successful model, their population is far bigger than our population. They have that dedicated funding source. We do not currently have that dedicated funding source. And they're not necessarily creating new services, but they're merging and blending their existing services to eliminate gaps. We don't necessarily need to create new services. We need to enhance our current services, coordinate our current services, and make sure that we have the capacity in each of those services to serve our growing population of homeless, of mentally ill and untreated, and of those who are cycling in these systems. And again, our homeless resource centers, for example, are serving anybody who comes to their door. They are the last resort for homeless individuals, which is why they have such a population of chronically homeless. Because when someone is exited out of another program, the only place they can go is to an HRC. And if they're exited out of the HRC, the only option left is jail or the street. So we've got to build capacity. These are some of the gaps we've identified in Salt Lake County. Again, the services are there. There needs to be an upgrade in capacity. The pieces in bold at the top are what are the definitions of each of the intercepts. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but I am going to go through intercept 0 and 1. At intercept 0, that's that community level, you last year were gracious enough to help fund additional MCOT teams for Salt Lake County. So we now have 5 of those teams. Best practice for a county our size is 9 to 13 of those teams. MCOT teams are the teams who go out when there's a mental health crisis where a person is yelling at someone on the street or is in a moment of deep psychosis causing issues. And rather than send law enforcement, you send a mental health professional and a peer to help get them into treatment at that point. That's a great example of how the intercepts work. Group homes for severe mental illness. This is a very successful program in Salt Lake County. When we can put folks with severe mental illness together in group homes, they can work through those illnesses with people who understand what they're going through, with the right support services, with the right treatment services, and be very successful. And we are always looking for additional group homes. Those are not things we necessarily have to build. Those are things where we convince landlords that they want to rent the home to us so that we can put individuals within those homes. Housing, of course, you heard, it's 77,000 units. Any funding you give to housing is desperately needed, desperately appreciated, and makes a world of difference. Services for people with disabilities. We know people with intellectual and developmental disabilities going into our jail and prison systems are not able to get the treatment they need and can be misdiagnosed in those systems, not to mention the ongoing waiting list we have for those services for individuals. Street medical services help us reduce the EMS calls. If we can have people being treated on the streets where they're at, we can hopefully reduce some of the misuse of hospital emergency departments. Domestic violence services, UDVC has a great home safe program that keeps people, this is a prevention method, that keeps people housed by helping pay some of those expenses that might lead them to not pay their rent and they'll end up evicted, such as they can't pay rent for a month. So we can provide them with that rent for the month and they stay housed and then they're able to stabilize and get their income back on a level where they can continue to pay rent. And the HRC's operating deficit. Since opening, our 3 homeless resource centers have been funded below their actual needs, about $2 million per resource center below actual needs. That gap has not been filled for the past 3 years since they opened in 2019, so more than 3 years. That gap needs to be filled in order for them to be able to continue to provide the services they do and hopefully enhance their services. At Intercept 1, we're seeing capacity issues in staffing across all of these systems. As we know, there is a workforce issue that continues with each of these systems. And again, as Wayne mentioned, when we're paying case managers less than the market rate they need to afford housing, we're asking our case managers who work with the homeless to do that work knowing that they're on the verge of homelessness as well because of that lack of a living wage for those folks. Detox, Volunteers of America Detox Program, they are expanding, which is incredibly needed, and more beds will continue to be needed. When officers bring someone who needs to detox to a detox bed and there isn't one, that leaves them with no options, leaves them very frustrated because now they're stuck with the individual and now they need to take them to jail. So detox beds are critical. Peer navigators I've mentioned, and again, housing, housing, housing. We will never stop talking about housing. And I will turn over to Sean McMillan, but happy to take any questions at this point as well.
Okay, Representative Bristol.
You leave, Gene. I mean, I remember the second day, them putting us on a bus and taking us to one of the, they do have a couple of things they don't have besides $93 million a year. I remember the facility was gated in front with wire. I mean, we were obviously not coming to take services. I remember there were 2 5-story wings. We were told that if they walked in and promised not to use drugs or alcohol, they had a room. And at the back of the courtyard, there was eating, there was a cafeteria, and they got 3 meals a day.
Yeah.
And on the bottom of the wing on the right, there was a facility, a woman's shower, and next to it was women's clothes for women. There was a male facility. There were clothes for men, then a men's shower. And one of the people working there told me that if they would use the mail room, the mail facilities for a month, they would give them a certificate, a piece of paper, which the state of Florida would use and would give them a state certificate, a state ID, which you need.
Right.
If you're not a
For
driver, then you need the state ID.
Yeah.
And when I was helping homeless people try and find housing downtown, they lose their stuff and their stuff gets stolen all the time.
Right.
And you're constantly waiting for them to apply for jobs, to apply for housing, because they have to mail away to another state for a birth certificate because they have to take that to go to show to someone to get X in order to get to get the driver's license, to get the state ID, and you're always waiting to get that stuff done. And then you get that done, and then you have to wait for the other things, and you have to wait for the other things. I mean, and we toured another building that they'd recently purchased, which they're retrofitting to do some similar work. And one of their hopes was that not only would people be able to come there from jail because the judge would say, hey, you're willing to go into this facility instead of going to jail? Great. They could walk in off the street and they would take them.
Yeah.
But I know that the Huntsman Center down in South Salt Lake has that goal too, and that's coming online 2024.
The bridge will come in hopefully this November and then the full facility next year, yeah.
Sometime in 2024. Well, I appreciate Wayne's efforts. I'm always singing his praises and telling people there's really good work going on, and I know he's working hard on it, besides all these other groups here.
Yeah, and I will say, there's work for this coming session, there's talk of how do we address the ID problem. We are working on figuring out some court options where we can do that same kind of model, where someone who's got, 10 warrants around all of the justice courts in Salt Lake County will take care of those warrants. You do this for a year, and we'll make any prosecution end. That'll be the end of it for you, and you'll get on your feet. So there's lots of pieces
I
happening.
know Judge Landau is doing some of that now, a
Yes.
couple
Yeah.
of days a month, he's going down
Yeah.
to help people clear.
Salt Lake Justice
Misdemeanors.
Court is piloting, and then we're working with the state courts as well to see if we can, because one of the problems is each of the justice courts is their own jurisdiction. So, we want to be able to I've got warrants in West Valley City and Holiday and Salt Lake City, and let's deal with them all in one place, knowing that the person who is homeless has really no transportation options to get to all of those different courts. And let's get them into treatment at
I was
that point.
talking with people in the audience before the meeting today, and I think there's far more going on than the public knows.
Yes, there is a
And one of
lot
our
going
and one
on.
of our goals is to help the public know what we're doing.
Yes, thank you so much, Joe.
Thank you, Gene. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go over to Representative Moss.
You. And thank you for your efforts, Wayne and Jean. It's really impressive, and your report is so detailed. I really appreciate that. Just one question I'd like one of you to respond to, and that is, I think you had 36% said people are homeless or have mental illness or substance use disorder. I read an article recently by a mental health professional that said that it's harmful to, because you hear people say all the time, well, they're all mentally ill, that it's harmful to people with mental illness to be is kind of a stigma to assume that everyone that's homeless, because a lot of people are homeless because they lost their job and they're just one rent check away from being evicted. And then if you were homeless suddenly, yeah, you'd probably get very depressed, and maybe you'd manifest certain symptoms, but would you just respond to that? Because I don't think they are all, if you want to say, what is mental illness, like bipolar or schizophrenic? I'm sure there's some that are, but could you respond to that?
Yes, I'd love to respond to that because I have some experience with it. When I got into this position, I'm a real estate developer, an accountant. I had no idea about homeless services. The governor didn't select me because I was an expert in that. He knew that we would need to have these conversations with the legislature, and I have a lot of experience there. So I have now, over the last 2 years, I spend hours weekly with an unsheltered population, getting to know them, gone on outreach with a number of different teams, engaging with people that are actually experiencing homelessness. I think we gotta understand it right from them. And I can tell you there isn't any person, not one, that I've met that doesn't have, that's not on the spectrum of mental health. We're all on the spectrum of mental health, though, okay, right?
Yeah, we're legislators.
But everybody is on the spectrum, especially if you're a member of the legislature. Maybe that's on the severe side. Been there, I understand that. I'm not talking about that one end of that spectrum that's severe and persistent mental illness, okay, schizophrenia and stuff. But everybody's dealing with high anxiety, either because of what's happened to them sometime in their life or what's happening to them. They're living on the street. They don't get rest. How do you feel when you don't? How do I feel when I don't get a good night's rest? Or I don't eat consistently, or it deregulates people and creates stress in their life. Where's my next meal going to come? My backpack was just stolen with my driver or my state ID in it. Now, I can't even apply for a job because we all have to fill out the I-9 form. You got to have your Social Security card. You got to have, these different IDs to even get a job. So this is the stress that people are feeling. And so, yes, everybody's on that spectrum somewhere, even if it's just, well, high anxiety has a lot of negative effects in our life. When you're anxious, you don't think right, you don't, that's what happens to me anyway. I'm just not, when I'm not regulated, you know, you're just not functioning as well. And it's on steroids with people that are experiencing the shelters, because the first thing we ask people to do, they're living unsheltered on the street, hey, come to shelter. You're going to sleep with 50 people in the room tonight. That triggers all kinds of things for people. So it's little wonder that the first reason why people, the highest response from people experiencing homelessness, why they don't go into shelter is, I don't feel safe. That it all fits together and explains exactly what we're dealing with this more persistent homeless population. So I don't know if that answers your question.
That's very illuminating. Thank you very much, because I think you've really explained it well, and kudos to you because you really get to know them. But as you said, it's trauma. It's trauma they're dealing with. So whether you were behaving in a perfectly sane way before, everything crumbles. So that's a really good explanation and increases my understanding. Thank you.
Thanks.
Representative Jack, did you have your light on?
Oh, yeah, it's on, but I didn't push it.
Okay, all right. Let's go over to Representative Walter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Wanted to share a comment. First is, I think that the work that we're seeing done is really quite extraordinary, and I think that we're on the right track, and thank you for sharing particular experience about how we can take this a direction that solves some of the root of the issues, as opposed to just trying to put people in homes of which some of them do not want to be in. I appreciate that point. I just want to emphasize the point that was made about the correlation between homelessness and housing affordability or housing attainability. And right now in our state, we have a real challenge with housing attainability. And if we aren't able to figure out successfully how to address the housing attainability issues, our homelessness issue will become much more acute and much more challenging than it is today. And I think that you accurately presented some of that data. I'll just point out that this week in the Wall Street Journal, they reported that in the last 3 years, California has spent $20 billion on homeless efforts. And the city of San Francisco just last year spent over $600 million unsuccessfully addressing their homelessness problem. And a lot of it has to do with the reasons that we've heard discussed today, which is a lack of attainable housing and a lack of the right kind of services that help people get started on a path where they can actually stay and want to be in, they want to be housed. And so I think this is a really critical issue for us to focus on and to continue to put efforts into. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Representative Cutler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In your presentation on the slide about chronic homelessness and permanent supportive housing, you pointed out that between 2012 and 2017, we increased permanent supportive housing by a huge amount, 46%, 800 beds. But the last 4 years, we haven't increased the number of beds significantly. This seems to suggest that we're putting money in the wrong place. So is that, am I reading that wrong, or is there just not the opportunity to do that?
Well, we haven't really put a lot of effort forth. And I know the budget, at least back when I was in the legislature, and I didn't see it change much until last year. The state's ongoing commitment to housing has been like $2 to $3 million until last session. Top 3 issue in the state, and the legislature's ongoing commitment to a couple of million a year to help draw down federal funds. I think we need to rethink that a little bit. I mean, we spend billions in education, needed. You got a tough job. Balance, what revenue you have available, but the effort in housing has just not been there. And thankfully, we got some ARPA funds last year, and we got some ARPA funds this year, and we're creating some pretty significant numbers of deeply affordable housing with that. If we can continue that now, maybe even scale down, whatever the legislature deems what they can afford to give us. It's one-time funds. It'll make a difference.
So part of the issue is it just takes so many years after you invest that money to make a difference.
Mm-hmm. We have a provider here, SwitchPoint, who also does housing. You give them the money to do that, they're converting hotels, and they can do it within a year, which is good because they're not having to rebuild or build something; they're just remodeling something. But we need it as quick as possible, and but it'll take time no matter what.
Thanks for that explanation.
Okay, Senator Plum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There were a couple, I know you have a couple of great presenters too, so I don't want to chat with too much time, but I think that the scope is hard for a lot of people to gauge. We see the 8,000 to 9,000 number that you'd reported, but the number of folks who actually have, touches with the homeless services programming throughout the years, it's higher than that, and it's higher than it's ever been, isn't it? Is that my understanding correct?
Yeah, let me give you a couple other data points.
Yeah.
I think it's really important for everybody to know here. In 2022, 28,500 people touched the homeless services system in the state of Utah. And then we showed 8,600 new people experiencing homelessness for the first time. Then we show the point-in-time count on one night in our shelters and unsheltered, as many as we could count. It's close, but it isn't completely accurate. 3,700. 28, 37. What happened to the difference? There's an acute or temporary homeless population. They get in and they get back out. If we look at the shelter data, 77% of the people that go to shelter are there less than 90 days. But we're also finding now that there is a population in the shelter that are staying longer and longer and longer because there's no housing on the other side of shelter. And so that's really their only place to be. And that's not, it's supposed to be temporary. We want throughput. We want them there less than 90 days. And we won't have to do any more shelter. We probably could close a shelter if we had enough resources on the other side of the shelter. So, I mean, those are the gaps that, that we can see we need to fill, and we're working now hard to fill those gaps. But, I talk about that temporary but there's the persistent population, the more chronic. These are people that have been in housing multiple times. They haven't had a chance. They've been in treatment multiple times or having multiple incidents with the criminal justice system. These are the people that are going to need heavy support and opportunities to be able to get off the street and out of the shelter.
Just quick follow-up, Mr. Chair, if I may. I think my head was starting to look a little like a bobblehead with all the nodding, with the things that you all, because as someone who works within the community somewhat and also works in an emergency department, as these numbers go up of folks touching the system, and they are in the very expensive spaces, be it our emergency department, be it our, our courts and our criminal justice system, our jails, I think you're really hitting the spots where if we don't bring down some of those costs with the things that actually work, we'll be truly buried. So this was really informative, and I think that I'm hoping many of my colleagues found it as insightful too, because we really do have to do things better and smarter in this realm. So thank you for your work.
Now, Mr. Chair, if I just may, Sean and Mary that are coming up now, these are providers. Now of what we're talking about as a provider. So we wanted them to take a few minutes.
All right, let's have them come up then.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sean McMillan. I am the Executive Director of First Step House, and I'd like to introduce Mary T. Calhoun. Mary T. is the First Step House Director of Development, and we're gonna take it down from the macro level down to the provider level. So, first, a bit about First Step House. We were founded in 1958. Most of our services are located here in Salt Lake. Actually, all of our services are located here in Salt Lake County. Today, we are a Joint Commission accredited behavioral health services provider. And Joint Commission is an entity that accredits healthcare organizations. So I say that because I want to communicate to you that we are considered a healthcare organization by entities like Joint Commission. We serve about 1,500 people a year in a multitude of different settings, including residential treatment, outpatient treatment, but also recovery housing, permanent supportive housing, and through our supportive services. Been around for 65 years. Our mission is to help people build lives of meaning, purpose, and recovery. So we provide this slide to you to give you a sense for our continuum of services, and I really want you to think of it as a continuum. People would start at the residential level, but then transition to lower, less intensive levels of care. So an individual who may have entered our down into our transitional housing, this assumes an individual doesn't have a safe, supportive environment to transition to once they're ready to transition out of residential treatment. We also serve a number of people who they need supportive housing at the end of all of this. Am I okay?
Yeah. We just need to swap. Excuse me, Kevin Burt, DWS. Wayne Niederhauser has to present in another committee, so we have to swap out computers.
It's okay. Are we back up?
Yep, we can see it.
All right, great. So Mary T will get us to the slide that we were on. But we were talking about permanent supportive housing, so that would be another step in the continuum of services that we would provide for those people that we serve who deal with chronic problems, serious problems that are not going to go away. These are folks who are going to need supportive services over long periods of time. The secret sauce is that First Step House has built out a set of wraparound services, supportive services, that stick with the people who are enrolled in our programs and help them compensate for those gaps that are present in their lives. We help them with employment. We help them access health care and continue to access that health care as needed, and other sorts of important services. And then because of the good work that we've been able to do in the community, other organizations have sought partnerships with us. They've invited us to provide those wraparound supportive services in their housing settings, in some of the other settings, like the Homeless Resource Center program, where First Step House employees are on site at the HRCs, helping individuals transition out of homelessness. We have a case management team over at the Switchpoint Airport project, and we're also starting to talk about developing another supportive services program at one of their new facilities. And there are others in the work.
So we've been serving a high-need, very low-income population for 65 years. And so we've seen firsthand again and again that treatment doesn't work for this population without housing. And at the same time, housing doesn't work without treatment. So over the years, we've built up a suite of really comprehensive wraparound supportive services so that we're supporting all aspects of a person's life, helping them build the self-sufficiency, gain the stability to be able to maintain their housing after treatment. About 10 years ago, we decided to develop our own supportive housing. We recognized that we already know how to do the treatment, we already know how to do the services, and in many ways, that's the hard part. All we had to do was find a way to put a roof over that. And that's a lot of what we're talking about with you today, is how we did go about funding and what our hopes are for continuing to fund supportive housing projects going forward. We're doing this now because the chronic homelessness is increasing, and it only continues to increase for the population that we serve. People with very high needs, people with serious mental illness and serious behavioral health conditions.
Where am I?
Like that.
Okay. So Central City Apartments is one of our permanent supportive housing projects. 75 one-bedroom units with 75 project-based housing vouchers. The target population for Central City Apartments are individuals who meet the statutory criteria for serious mental illness. So when I say that, I'm talking people who are dealing with schizophrenia, bipolar illness that is disabling, depression that is non-responsive to treatment. Medina Place is a 40 one-bedroom unit permanent supportive housing project with 40 Section 8 vouchers, on-site supportive services. The target population are individuals who are high utilizers of behavioral health services in Salt Lake County. With that, I'll turn it back over to Mary T.
So these two projects are operated and funded a little differently based on the population served. Let me just go back a sec.
All right.
So at Central City Apartments, our population qualifies for the Medicaid supported living rate because everyone there has a serious persistent mental illness. At Medina Place Apartments, the population we serve, they qualify as high need based on the recurrent cycles of homelessness and institutionalization, but they do not qualify for the Medicaid supportive living rate. So our funding in that building is a little trickier. We'll show you some of the details in a minute. So all clients in all of our treatment and housing programs at First Step House benefit from those wraparound supportive services we talked about. Our typical client has been in and out of homelessness. They have a criminal record. They may have outstanding legal obligations they're still trying to work through. And it's probably been a lot of years since they've had any kind of medical care. So at First Step House, they have a case manager who's helping them secure housing that will accept their background check. They're working with an employment program that gets them trained for a new career and helps them land a job before they finish treatment. They're working with peer support services. They're working with a medical provider who can start treatment for a long-term chronic disease and get them set up with a primary care provider. But those programs are all funded through really a patchwork of different sources, public and private, grants, philanthropy, corporate, and individual donations.
So back to me. All right. So we fund affordable housing projects with a number of different tools. In fact, our job when we're doing this type of housing is to create what's called a funding stack. The most powerful tool is what is called federal low-income housing tax credits. Recently, in the last legislative session, the Utah State Legislature brought forward a new tool for us, the state low-income housing tax credit. So thank you very much. The other components are a combination of state and federal dollars, as Mary T. mentioned, but also philanthropy. What we're trying to do with this funding stack is bring down the debt as much as possible, because what we need to do and what most deeply affordable housing providers want to do is bring that debt down as far as possible so that there's as much as possible spinning off of operating costs that we can then reinvest back into services, because funding those services is the most difficult thing that we have to do in many ways. I share this slide with you, this slide, just to give you a sense. You can look at that, and I'm happy to answer questions.
So Sean mentioned that funding the ongoing services for these projects is kind of its own beast. So we just wanted to give you a glimpse of what that looks like at our two current PSH projects. So Central City Apartments, that's where our residents qualify for the Medicaid supported living rate. And that brings in over $1 million. And then we're able to bill fee-for-service outpatient treatment to Medicaid on that project as well. So it leaves only a pretty small gap that we fund with foundation grants. At Medina Place Apartments, We don't have that supportive living rate, so we bill outpatient fee-for-service to the county and to Medicaid. We also have gap funding from the Department of Workforce Services, and everything else we fill with foundations and private philanthropy. So we've walked you through how and why First Step House develops permanent supportive housing. The funding model that we've described has limitations. And first, simply that the funding available is insufficient to meet the true need of the homeless population in Utah. And a reason for that is there will always be a portion of that homeless population that does have serious mental illness, that does require more than a roof over their head. They require ongoing support in order to maintain stability and prevent a return to homelessness. To start a new supportive housing project, it requires significant time, resources, and effort to track down all these different funding sources to build that initial funding stack that we showed. And then each funding source comes with its own compliance requirements that follow the life of the project, and that requires, a lot of attention. Then to fund the ongoing supportive services, that's its own challenge. So Medicaid is an amazing source of funding when the population served qualifies for the supportive living rate. But even then, it's incredibly complex. And we want to draw your attention to the fact that there are relatively few providers that can do what First Step House does. We can bill Medicaid to the extent that we do on these projects because we've been a behavioral health care provider for decades. And so we've built up the infrastructure to be able to navigate that complex billing. We have the cash in the bank so that we can wait for payments because we're working with 6 different payers, and it just takes a lot of back and forth. It sometimes takes a lot of waiting. And then in addition, we have the experience actually serving the incredibly sick population that is served by this type of funding. There aren't many providers that are ready to do that tomorrow. And it's worth thinking about because it means when we ask how to fund this type of project, we also have to think about then how can it get done? We supplement Medicaid with grants. And the grant funding that we get for services is year to year. It's non-renewable, and often the amounts don't keep pace with the rising costs of the projects. So all this is to say, when we commit to doing a supportive housing project, we commit to taking on a pretty high administrative burden. A dedicated funding stream for supportive housing would open the door to more development of more service-rich permanent housing projects like these. So why should we explore additional ways to fund supportive housing in Utah? Because it works. 93% of folks who entered a permanent housing project with support were still housed a year later. Those are folks who were homeless and are not homeless anymore. Building the kind of deeply affordable housing with supports for this population, it keeps people off the street. It also reduces the burden on our shelter system, on our jail system, on our hospital emergency systems, and it reduces preventable deaths, and it reduces returns to homelessness. When we talk about the need for affordable housing in Utah, we're talking about also the need for deeply affordable housing that has that built-in support for the population who can't stay housed without it. The kind of housing we're talking about has a built-in safety net. So we plan for the fact that people will have ups and downs in their mental illness, that people will struggle at some point and we'll be there to respond with services and support so that they can keep their housing even though they struggle. But these services are expensive, and more funding will make the difference between supportive housing and just plain housing. And supportive housing that's deeply affordable will make the difference on homelessness in our state.
That's our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any questions for the presenters? Don't see anything, so you must have done a really good job.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, next we've got Sean Guzman. Okay, introduce yourselves.
Good afternoon. I'm Sean Guzman. I am the Government Affairs Director for the City of St. George, and I'm joined today by Carol Hallowell, who is the CEO of SwitchPoint, and you've heard a little bit about SwitchPoint earlier, and we'll discuss that a little further. We've been on the challenges of operating a rural shelter. And St. George, it's kind of a unique area. I like to refer to us as rurban because when I started in St. George, when I relocated down there in 2003, we were the 17th largest city in Utah, and now we're the 5th largest city. So we've seen a little bit of growth, and along that, a growth in our homeless population as well. But we still are a rural area, and we're unique in the services we provide. So I thought what would be helpful is to tell a little bit about the story of SwitchPoint in St. George and how we arrived at where we are today. In 2010, thereabouts, we had a shelter operating in St. George. We had concerns expressed by businesses and residents near that shelter about the impacts of the shelter in their area. But more importantly, we had a lot of concerns raised about the services that were being provided there and the lack of some services, as well as the conditions in that shelter facility. And as a city, we had been supportive of the shelter, but we did not operate the shelter in any way. We had limited interaction with the shelter. Our police department interaction with the shelter was mainly in response to calls and not as a collaborative effort. And at that time, Carol was working with the 5-County Association of Governments, and she began talking to us about some possible solutions to the problems that we saw there. We quickly realized that the current structure and those that were operating the shelter would not have the bandwidth to continue to do that, and no one was going to step up to do it. So the City of St. George stepped up. We purchased a facility that was a former school facility and the land adjacent to it, and turned that into a homeless shelter and essentially took over all of the operations of the homeless shelter in Washington County for the entire area. And when we created that, we decided we needed a director. Carol had proposed a plan. We liked it, so we hired Carol at the time, and we also came up with the SwitchPoint name and brand and began operating the shelter. And then I'll turn it over to Carol right now to explain where we've gone from there.
Well, thanks, Sean. Thank you for having us today. We at SwitchPoint really looked at how could we be more holistic in the approach of serving the homeless and in that area. And it was a unique area because the only services really for any of the services, not just shelter, were in the city of St. George that were going to serve all of really the southern part of Utah. So we dived in and created this 84-bed shelter, but we made sure that it was a 24-hour access, and that was really important to us. Instead of the previous shelter would kick everybody out in the morning, and then they'd start over lining up again, kind of a traditional model of shelter. So we became the first actual community resource center in the state at that time. We provide 17 classes a week at our shelter, and we call ourselves a community resource center instead of a shelter. But we also then said, let's build a food pantry. So we did that in 2015, and that food pantry serves about 700 households every week in Washington County. So it's a pretty busy, robust campus. Then we also thought, oh man, as we figure out how to do these funding sources and as we look at the needs of our population, let's open up a thrift store. One of the things that we were really grateful for was our partnershiping with the city, was to say, these are the services and the gaps that we need. How can we utilize our space and our campus or look at some conditional use permits to keep expanding in the areas that we need. So right across the street was kind of some warehousing that we said, let's put our first thrift store there. And that allowed us to then take on some donations from our community, and so we did that in 2016. The next thing that happened is we went, man, we sure have a lot of dogs coming with clients, and it's not a good spot. At 115 during the summer, not a good thing to have a lot of dogs outside, and we didn't have enough space inside to allow people to bring their animals with them. So we opened up a doggy daycare business, and that was really threefold. One was to put these extra dogs that came with the population into a safe, air-conditioned space. And number two was to also say, hey, some of these clients needed some work skills, and so let's have them work in our doggy daycare business. And then the next was to create some unrestricted dollars. So we opened our doggy daycare business. And then we really started, as we've heard a lot today, looking at, now what do we do with our population? We need housing. And so again, partnering with City of St. George, they donated the land, and in 2020 we did a low-income tax credit project and built a 55-unit of 1, 2, 3, and 4 bedroom units. We have about 176 people that live there. A lot of families go into those 4 bedrooms. But that Riverwalk Village really helped us with creating our first affordable housing. We also then said during COVID, as we operated through one of the hotels that the city had purchased, we better do this hotel as our quarantine. And we operated that during COVID to keep a safe space we were getting referrals and clients from the hospital, from our shelter, obviously, to keep the shelter safe during COVID. But that also helped us figure out maybe we could use some of that art money to purchase hotels and turn them into deeply affordable housing. And so that is what happened during that 2022 era, is we purchased a hotel in St. George and converted it into deeply affordable housing, studio apartments. SwitchPoint now operates in Tooele County, Salt Lake County, St. George, and in Washington County, and we're working in Davis County. It gives us a unique perspective of what happens in homeless systems throughout the state, but especially the differences that are in shelters or homeless populations that are outside of the Wasatch Front. One of the last things that we started looking at was gaps with childcare. Families can't get out of poverty or out of homelessness unless they have reliable, accessible, affordable childcare. And so last year we opened up a 24/7 childcare center called Stepping Stones in Washington County. And we can take up to 270 kids a day during that 24-hour period. And we've been busy since the day we opened. So those are some of the unique things that we've been able to do as we partner with the city and look at how we can address those needs in kind of a urban, I like that, a urban population. So next slide.
And as we're going to the next slide, I'll point out that some of these services, some of these businesses, well, all of the businesses that they're operating, isn't just to provide a service. It's because we have a severe lack of funding. We'll talk about that in a minute. And that's to help make up that gap. So, and I'd also like to point out that the City of St. George's commitment, besides the $1 million plus for the building itself to house the shelter and the land adjacent, but is $1 million on the Riverwalk apartments with a donation of the land and also a waiver of all the fees. So we took on those fees in order to get that operating and up and going. So we have been heavily committed, even though we weren't a large city when we started this, and we're becoming a large city, but we've put our money where the rubber hits the road. Now, this next slide is a heat map that shows where our encounters are with homeless individuals. And the reason why we wanted to show you this is what you'll face any rural city. Let's say if Vernal begins to grow, I know Moab faces a lot of these issues too, but as you begin to grow and the homeless population begins to grow, in a rural county, all of the services that are provided by the state, those mental health services, other services, are located in these cities. So the population from throughout those rural areas will tend to congregate here. There's been some talk about on mitigation funding, looking at a radius around a shelter to say, well, that's where the impact's going to be. But if you'll look at this slide, you'll see SwitchPoint is on the west side of our city, and obviously there are a lot of There are a lot of encounters over there, but it's spread out throughout the city, and there are reasons for that. One is because we have a bus service, probably the largest bus service outside of UTA in the state that we operate. And that bus service is essential to those that are unhoused to get the services they need. Also, that, not surprisingly, a lot of our washes and other locations it follows a lot of those. And we have an extensive trail network of over probably close to 50 miles in St. George. And the trails are very convenient for those that aren't housed in the shelter, don't want to be for various reasons. You've heard about those issues. That it's an easy way for them to get to those stores that they need. And also we have the 2 providers of low or no cost medical care that are located in St. George, the Doctor's Clinic and the Family Health Care. We've been instrumental in helping both of those organizations with their buildings as well so that they can provide those services. So because those services are in St. George, the homeless population throughout Washington County tends to come to St. George. Another issue that we face, and I'll let Carol talk a little bit about that, is in rural areas, we have a lot of public lands around us. So if you were to go out just immediately west of Bloomington in St. George, onto BLM property, you'll find a lot of encampments out there. And these are people, for various reasons, don't have a place to live and find that it's a little less restrictive for them to go out and live in those areas. So we do get police calls out there, even though it's outside the city, and have to respond to those. But we also encounter those that are on the Arizona Strip, just across the border. And to give you an idea of where we are in St. George now, my county attorney, his subdivision, his block wall in his backyard, if you were to hop over it, you're in Arizona. I think he did that on purpose so he could evade the law. But we have grown to the very border of the state. So there's a population out there. In fact, earlier when Senator Niederhauser was talking about the pit count, the point in time, we counted people, we ventured onto the Strip and counted people out there, but we're not allowed to include those in our pit counts. Even though they're all being served in St. George, there's no way to get to services in Mojave County from the Arizona Strip. In fact, the sheriff's deputies and those resource officers that take care of the Strip live in St. George, right? Because you can't get to Kingman very easily. So, but we don't get to take advantage of that. But Carol, why don't you talk a little bit about?
Yeah, the important thing, especially in these rural areas, Tooele has the same problem that we're serving clients from Wendover that come into our Tooele City Resource Center. But in Washington County especially, we are bordered by a pretty large swath. We get clients that are coming in regularly from the Mesquite Police, and then we have Mojave sheriffs bringing us people who are now getting released from jail. Navajo Nations, there's no jailing system there. They're bringing all their people to us from there. And so as this bordering county, we're feeling this push that we're serving really everybody that's within a 100-mile radius. And during the pit this year, we had 43 that were counted in that Arizona Strip who all had Utah license plates, whose kids were enrolled through our homeless school liaison into our school systems, but we couldn't count them in the pit because they were living on Arizona land. And that gets really frustrating, but there's also an area called Black Rock where we have at least 50 campers that are living there because they've been priced out. They cannot afford to live in Washington County, but they're still working there. Their kids are still in school, if they have kids. And so we see this, and we've been seeing this for the 9 years that I've been operating Switchpoint.
One other thing I'd like to add as far as this heat map here is, in St. George, we have a different approach with our police officers. Obviously, when we purchased the shelter and got it up and running, one of the things we want to do is integrate our police officers with the shelter staff, and Carol has been extremely supportive on that. So our goal was not to have the need to station an officer in our shelter. We feel like we need an operator that can operate a shelter in a safe manner, call us when they need us, but we also make routine stops there. We interact with the staff there. We interact with those that are staying there. But what we do is train all of our officers that as they're out in the community and they're interacting with the homeless individuals, to have the information available to them on how they can get into the shelter, what services they provide. We interact with Carol and her staff to let them know if there's an individual out there that is not wanting to come in but need some services, so they can do their reach out as well. But we think this works best to train all of our officers to be prepared. In fact, this summer, you probably heard, we had a very hot summer. Our officers had water in their vehicles to hand out to homeless individuals when they encountered them, because we were very concerned about.
So we implemented Code Red versus Code Blue, and that was really important. This was our first year doing that, where we coordinated with law enforcement to say, hey, we got 60 pallets of water donated, and here's the cards, here's the resources, anytime you're coming upon someone. So anything that was over 112 degrees, then officers would come to us, fill up their vehicles with water and flyers, so that we could make sure that people had a place where they could cool down. And we had identified cooling stations around the county, because that's our number one cause of death for homeless in southern Utah, is going to be heat versus the cool.
And we have a bike patrol, an extensive bike patrol team, and they patrol our trails. They are close to the washes, and they interact with Carol and her staff, because they're the ones most likely to encounter homeless individuals in our parks and on our trails and other areas of the city. And we can go to the next slide, but as we're going to the next slide, I would like to echo something that Jean said, and that is the MCOT teams. A lot of these individuals that we encounter do have mental health issues. We have a resource center now that's opening up in Washington County with the assistance of the legislature, and we thank you for that money to get that operational. We have one MCOT team. I'm on the Behavioral Health Crisis Response Commission, and I'm very well aware of the lack of MCOT teams in Salt Lake County. They're short, and the ones that are there are overworked. But we need to get to a point where our officers feel comfortable in our 911 PSAPs, that when we get a call for help with an individual experiencing a mental health issue, whether they're housed or unhoused, that someone can respond within a short amount of time, so that that officer isn't in a situation where it escalates to something that it doesn't need to be. It frees them up to do other things, as Jean mentioned, but also to help those with the mental health issues to get to the right services that Carol can provide and SwitchPoint can provide quickly. And so we fully support the funding, additional funding for MCOT teams throughout the state. By the way, for the rural areas, and that's what we're talking about today, we're also talking about a VCOT team, video MCOT, that can go out and in those rural areas where you can't get a therapist out quickly, and have them available by video so that the officer responding can get that help that they need. So it's very important to the rural areas as well. This slide is you've heard of the concern about the cost of housing in Utah. This will show you where we are in St. George. You can see on the left there, St. George, we are at $91,000 roughly for our median income versus 106 approximately in Provo-Orem and Salt Lake City, and 111 in Ogden and Clearfield. But when you look at the cost of housing for rent, you'll see that St. George is on par with, actually more expensive than Provo and Orem, and on par with Ogden and Clearfield, and yet our incomes are lower. On the way up, I gassed up my vehicle at the Maverick around the corner from my house in St. George, and I paid 15 cents more a gallon for gas than the Maverick that I just gassed up here in downtown Salt Lake City. Our costs are higher there, which makes it even more of a challenge, because we're seeing more and more individuals that are just simply priced out of the market in getting an apartment. And another concern that's been brought up is that there are apartments that are charging to apply for housing there. So there might be a $25 or $50 fee. And I know that I'm very well aware of that, because my 23-year-old daughter got a job up here and called me and said, "Dad, there aren't any apartments, and every time I go in, they're charging me a fee. If I pay 10 of these, and they're not even telling me if there is an apartment available, I'm paying $500, which means Dad's paying $500. But some people don't have that available. And when you're asked to come up with your first and last month's rent up front, and now you're paying to apply for an apartment, that really affects individuals' ability to get an apartment house. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Carol?
Yeah, we need to speed on it. We've still got 3 more items, so
Okay,
if you can
then next
wrap
slide.
up.
This is showing the problem that we face in the rural area as far as funding for our homeless shelter. You can see from this slide that we get approximately $4.62. Well, that's Lantern House, in Ogden. St. George gets $7.49 for funding per bed. And then you could see as it goes down, the funding for the other shelters in the state. But as we just discussed, our costs are no less than those in other parts of the state. And this is really affecting our ability to operate the shelter. In fact, we are just getting ready to expand the shelter, adding additional beds and remodeling the current facility to add additional beds. But at this current funding rate, unless we've asked for parity. That's what we like to say is we need parity in the funding because the costs in our area of the state are no less, and in some cases more, than other areas of the state. And Carol, I don't know if you're intimately involved in this. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, I just think that there's a great opportunity this year through legislation to talk about if we're looking at a statewide issue, there really needs to be some kind of a formula and parity to talk about how do we address homelessness, whether it's in Ogden or Tooele or St. George or Iron County or Salt Lake, to say this is how much it costs, to address homelessness. And it can't be so lopsided when we're trying to all do the same thing and our costs of staff or the cost requirements to be licensed are the same. So that's what we're really looking for, is to say, hey, how do we create parity?
Well, thank you. Okay, we've got Representative Briscoe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Those two big bars on the bottom, Geraldine King and Gail Miller in my district, plus a VOA detox center. Carol, Mr. Guzman and I have spoken on the phone. People I know and trust sing your praises, and I'm really happy to meet you. Thank you for everything you do for this population and for these communities.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Representative Strong.
Yes, thank you. Before you got up, we were listening to the other presenters. I texted my mayor and good friend Natalie Hall, and she says to say hi, by the way, Carol. And
Thank you.
we don't face a homeless problem in Bluffdale, but Mayor Hall has been involved in working in some of your hotels you've been converting. She and children. And
40 of her neighbors.
What's that?
And 40 of her neighbors.
Well, and we should have been, I think my wife might have gone to one, and there was another one that we couldn't make, but I need to go. I actually have a few questions for you. First of all, a little praise from Mayor Hall. So you have this little chart here that you were showing, is $7.49 per, is that per day, per bed, or what does that equal?
That's correct, right. So what those numbers came from is the Office of Homeless Services on what they ended up funding per shelter, and then you divide that by the number of beds. So it's on the website to just say, hey, if we have 84 beds, this is the amount of money we got from the state, that's what that equals out to.
So it was kind of, you got this amount of money, you just said, this is how many beds we have, that's the money.
Yep.
So if we did that in some of these other locations, which are much higher dollar,
Right,
so it's not like
Lantern
a-
House is 333 beds, and you take the amount of money that the homeless service office.
Okay. Your model, and in fact, I talked to Mayor Hall, and she sent me a link to, before you even got up, I was showing Representative Jack here. I'm like, hey, look, have you heard of this place? Oh, yeah, I've heard of it. And I was kind of looking it up and I didn't know you were even here today. But could this kind of a program be duplicated, and I know you're doing it in a few other areas, but at these kind of costs nationally or in, our big cities and all that?
Right. Yeah, they could be. I think that the important thing is we had to look at it when we were not getting the same amount of funding, but we knew we needed to provide these types of services to create stabilization. And we looked at ourselves going, well, we need to create businesses, which is what we do. To help with our business sustainability model, right? And it shouldn't be just the state or our cities doing all the funding. As an example, I think there needs to be county support, and to date, it's been 9 years that we've been open. We've only received $50,000 from our county. There's got to be some kind of partnership that comes in with creating your own types of incomes through businesses, and having county at the table, having the cities at the table, and having a state at a table.
So that kind of leads me into another question, and this kind of comes from just a little comment that Mayor Hall made. She said something like, nobody gets a free ride.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
It means there's no entitlement in our model. And coat, you earn it. We created our own microeconomy, if you will, and we call it switch bucks. So I raised 4 sons, and so we ended up doing allowance, but they had to earn their stuff, right? So we say if you attend case management, you'll earn switch bucks. If you help clean at the pantry, you'll earn switch bucks. So we get them involved as clients into the whole system, and then they have this money, if you will, that they can then purchase their own coat or a bicycle or a bus pass or things that they need. This has really created a buy-in for clients on their own success. And so some of them end up with 1,000 switch bucks when they're ready to move into housing. They can walk across to the thrift store and pick out the furniture that they want. So it's been a really successful model over the 9 years.
Love it. I look forward to hearing more. I would actually like to talk to you afterward a little bit as well, but I think we need to apply these principles. And I know there's also a lot of volunteerism and things like that. Sometimes, when you live in Bluffdale, you don't see someone on the street very often out where I live, but I want to get involved, and I would love to see the legislature get involved with a lot more, I don't want to necessarily say funding, even though funding's required, but this accountability, this no one gets a free ride, this buy-in by everyone, because I think it'll benefit us. And then there's also close accountability on, hey, this is the dollar per bed, or whatever the case might be, and let's track those dollars and combine all that, include the volunteerism, et cetera. And just major thumbs up to you guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Looks like that wraps up the questioning. So
Thank
up and educating us on this. All right, let's welcome the economic development arm of the state. We got Director Ryan Starks here, and he's going to give us a report on the economic development.
Good afternoon with the committee. Appreciate your time, and we have 15 minutes allocated, and we'll certainly respect that. My name is Ryan Starks. I'm the Executive Director of the Governor's Office of Economic Opportunity, and wanted to share some of the good things happening in Utah's economy. So just to kind of start, I would like to introduce who we are. So we are, according to our mission statement, the stewards of the world's best economy and quality of life. And our mission really is to cultivate prosperity, future-proof Utah's economy, and work at the speed of business. A couple of accolades, as many of you know, that Utah continues to receive really outstanding accolades in terms of our economic performance. The American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, listed Utah as having the best economic outlook for the 16th year in a row. And then U.S. News and World Report listed Utah as having the best overall economy in the United States. So why am I here today? A couple of years ago, the Unified Economic Opportunity Commission was created under Governor Cox's leadership, and it pulls together members of the legislature, of the private sector, of various agencies of higher education, and collectively outlines a plan for the next 10 years so that we can maintain this really competitive economy that we all enjoy. May 10th of 2022, Governor Cox unveiled the Utah Economic Vision document, which outlines various strategies to help us economically through the year 2030. As part of that report, we've been asked by the legislature to detail some of the work that we're doing to implement the report, and we're really excited, feel like we've had 2 very solid years of work to kind of back up some of this information. Okay, we have various strategies within the report, and they include the education and talent pipeline, developing that, community and economic planning, economic opportunity for all, low regulations, low taxes, strong targeted industries. We want to become the startup state. We really want to focus on our rural parts of the state and also maintain our international connections and business community. As we grow as a state, we know that we have a lot of challenges, but a lot of opportunities. And so the purpose of this plan is to help prepare the state for the next 10 years of growth. Okay. The Governor's Office of Economic Opportunity is responsible for implementing this strategy, and we would like to detail some of the activities. Now, we did send the report to the chairs and the staff, and it's a lengthy report, but it's a good one, so we know it's the best report you will have read today, and invite you to read that. But for the sake of time, just wanted to highlight a few of the key strategies and successes, and specifically talk about our targeted industries. So a lot of times people will ask, well, what's Utah's economic development plan? What industries are really thriving? And so for many years, the state was open for business to any type of company or industry that had an interest in Utah. This report helps us be more focused and more targeted on specific industries that really bring along other segments of the economy. These industries provide high-quality jobs and are sustainable and are not going anywhere anytime soon. These industries include advanced manufacturing, aerospace and defense, financial services, life sciences and healthcare innovation, and software and information technology. And as you can see on this right side of the graph, we've grown significantly in each of these sectors over the past 5 years, with more anticipated growth on the horizon. So part of we call them clusters or targeted industries. What goes into really nurturing a targeted industry? There's a lot of things. It's access to capital, it's corporate recruitment, but one of the big things is workforce development. How can the state of Utah help train the next generation of workers to fill the jobs within these industries? And so we work closely with Talent Ready Utah at the Utah System of Higher Education to help kind of prime the pump for these industries in terms of workforce development. And as you can see, we have various tools and different programs, including the Talent Ready Connections, Utah Works, Learn and Work, the Deep Tech Talent Initiative, and so on. So each of these programs is built with the idea of supporting the workforce to fill these jobs. Under the Talent Ready Utah initiative, 8,427 individuals over multiple years were able to participate, which is really exciting for industry. We work hand in hand, and this is what they're asking for. So we talk about our economy. We know that as an office, we can't do everything alone, that it takes buy-in from partners, from the private sector, from key industry partnerships. One of the tools that we use to help plan our growth is called the EdTIF program, or the Economic Development Tax Increment Finance Program. And this is the incentive that the state offers to large companies who invest significant amounts of capital and who have plans to hire a lot of people. This is a post-performance tax credit. So, lest anybody ever asks, Utah is not in the business of providing cash up front to companies. In fact, the company has to invest and has to hire over a certain period of time. And then as they do that, this program will enable the company to receive a small percentage of their own investment in the form of a tax credit. So we're not paying companies, we're just rebating a percentage of the investment that they've already placed in the state. What's really exciting is about 2/3 of all of our incentives go to Utah-based companies. So sometimes there's the idea that we just want to recruit companies from California or Texas and that's it. But actually our focus is on taking care of our own companies, helping with that growth and as I indicated, 2/3 are Utah-based. From July 22nd to June 23rd, 16 companies participated in the EdTIF program and are collectively projected to create 3,630 new jobs, make $12.3 billion in new capital investments, pay more than $574 million in new state tax revenue, and provide just over $4 billion in new state wages over the next 20 years. So really exciting, and we're grateful for this program because it is making a difference. Now, under Governor Cox's leadership, as you know, he really wants to focus on rural Utah as well, creating economic opportunity for all. And the legislature in the 2020 session modified the EdTIF program and created the RedTIF program, which enables our office to work closely with companies that want to expand into rural parts of the state. This is really exciting, and it's a game changer for rural Utah. The projected capital investment in rural Utah from announced projects in fiscal year 23 amounts to more than $1.2 billion, with more than double the capital investment of 2017 to 2021 combined. So in other words, in 1 year, we're capturing more value and seeing more successes than we typically would in a 5-year cycle because of this program. So our office has approved 23 of these, we call them RedTIF, or the Rural EdTIF projects, since 2021, projecting almost 11,000 new high-paying jobs, all in rural Utah. Wanted to talk quickly about some of the other programs that we're involved with. And as I mentioned, we don't just recruit companies, but we're working with stakeholders across the entire state to make sure that we're planning for the future in terms of infrastructure and workforce development and housing, everything that goes into it. One of the programs I want to highlight is called the HTRZ program. And it helps address Utah's housing crisis by facilitating mixed-use, multifamily, and affordable housing developments within a 3rd-mile radius of a fixed commuter rail station. So if you think of major transportation hubs like TRAX or the Front Runner, that's typically where we want to see the density and the growth, and that helps with the congestion of traffic as these individuals can utilize public transportation. Thus far, 3 communities have been approved for the HTRZ program. These plans more than double the number of housing units that would have occurred without a property tax incentive. They add approximately 23,000 housing units. And again, based on the conversation we just had with some of the homeless challenges, this is helping to meet that need and solve that problem. And then this program has pledged over 2,500 units to be available to individuals with area median income between 60 and 80%. Okay, we're at 10 minutes. I just have a few minutes left, so thank you for your patience. Wanted to kind of talk about some of our other partnerships. As I mentioned, we want to make this a collaborative effort as we plan for the next 10 years of our economic development. So the first one that I want to focus on is Utah's Coordinated Action Plan for their economic vision. And its purpose is to unify the goals and direction of state government with the various regions, 7 AOG regions within the state. So representatives from our office, from GOPB, along with the 7 associations of governments, businesses, economic development professionals, have all taken part in numerous surveys and planning sessions over a 10-month period. And so now we have the honor of implementing these recommendations. But we also realize that we need a water plan. Water is instrumental to economic development. As we're meeting with companies, we're doing an analysis to ensure that they have adequate water. And so with that in mind, there has been a coordinated action plan for water. Under the direction of Governor Cox, some of the participants are GOPB, DNR, DEQ, and others. And their purpose is to establish a statewide water cooperative action plan that prioritizes conservation, storage, agriculture, preservation, and use optimization. So as we think about our economy, water's a part of that, as well as growth. What do we do with the influx of people? Utah continues to have a high population increase year after year. We have the Guiding Our Growth survey. So Laura Hansen from GOPB, the state planning coordinator, has done a fantastic job of really enlisting various stakeholders to understand what factors go into the next 10 years of growth. The conversation is a broad effort to explore what actions make sense in the face of population increases. It will run through 2023 and will help us plan for the next 10 years of success. Okay, so as we talk about opportunity for all, I want to highlight just 3 quick things. One is our Center for Immigration and New American Integration. 2 is our USBCI program, and 3 is our broadband program. So first, to talk about the immigration. Immigrants are an important part of our economy. They contribute to economic growth, and they comprise roughly 11% of our labor market. Our Center for Immigration and New American Integration helps connect workforce with talented workers who are immigrants who can contribute to our economy. Many of our sectors depend heavily on these wonderful people, and so we're just bridging that gap, leveraging the skill sets that these people have. Our statewide digital connectivity plan. We learned through COVID that without connectivity or adequate broadband, it's hard to do business. And so thanks to the Utah legislature, thanks to various grant programs, we've been able to help move the needle in this space. We created the legislature created the Utah Broadband Center Advisory Commission. The Utah Broadband Center developed a new statewide 5-year digital connectivity plan that will augment the efforts of the Federal Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, or the BEAD program. The state will receive $317 million to ensure all broadband serviceable Utah locations have high-speed internet. So anytime there's a grant opportunity, our broadband center is taking that grant and deploying it out to the communities in need here in the state. And then finally, I wanted to talk about the Utah Small Business Credit Initiative. This is a partnership with the U.S. Treasury in which the state of Utah will receive $69 million that will partner with financial institutions and loan these dollars out at low-cost capital to various communities, underserved communities throughout the state, including rural Utah. So we're really close to deploying these dollars with our banks and our financial institution partners. We anticipate the program will stimulate up to $690 million of private investment into Utah's small businesses. Governor Cox is really focused on not just corporate recruitment and corporate expansion, but also entrepreneurship, kind of like the 3-legged stool. And so he appointed the first ever entrepreneur in residence, a CEO and founder named Brad Bonham. Brad's been working with our office to develop some strategies on how to foster entrepreneurship throughout the state. We have a plan that's under formulation that will launch later this year. And without going into the details, let me just say we're really excited. We believe that Utah has the capability to become the startup capital of the world. So more information on that. A couple of more slides. Wanted to talk about how are we delivering our services and our programs to Utah. In the past, it would be that we had a team of outreach managers, but they were located here in the capital city. So if somebody, a mayor, a county commissioner, a business had a question, they would typically meet us in the food court at City Creek. We would do business and help them on their way. Now, however, we, as you can see, have various regions and various regional managers. And these are individuals who are from the local communities who can share information about the programs, help connect the dots with commissioners, mayors, chambers of commerce, small business service providers. And we're seeing a lot of good things as a result of this new model. So we're trying to get our services out to the people rather than have them just come to Salt Lake. okay, and we can see some of the growth within Utah rural communities. A couple of them are still struggling in terms of unemployment rates and population growth, but overall, we're laser focused on growing all parts of the economy, and we're having a lot of fun doing it. So I just wanted to say thank you to this committee. We appreciate your support as a team, and you can see my team behind me. We love what we're doing. We love Utah. We believe in Utah. We work around the clock to make sure that we have the best quality of life possible and the strongest economy possible. So with that, I'll answer any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We appreciate your team being here. Otherwise, you'd be a lone man here. It would. Let's go over to Representative Moss.
Thank you very much. I'm not tall enough for this. Thank you for what you do, Ryan, is that correct? And all the work your team does. And I admire a lot of what you're doing and making economic opportunities for people here in Utah. But you're very heavy on tech and business, and all the new members of the Board of Higher Education are as well. I listened to those hearings. But do you consider that we need teachers, that we have a shortage of teachers? And if we don't have good public education, we're not going to have these great people to run businesses. We need mental health professionals. We have problems in our jail and prisons and prison and jails, and we can't hire enough people for mental health professionals. And so in that group that was selected, 4 of them are head of tech companies, and one of them just laid off 400 employees just a week ago. So I would just urge you to look at the whole picture and how do we create a great economy by having a wonderful education system. And the same thing is true in higher ed, because we have great universities and colleges in Utah, but as some of those board members said, fast-tracking people through school doesn't mean that they don't take any of the humanities. They don't take psychology and philosophy and history and literature and all those things that make us human and make us good citizens. So I have a bit of a concern that way, but I'd like to see you start pushing for more teachers and administrators and school psychologists, because our schools of education are declining. People aren't going into it because they're all being told, hey, the best jobs, you can make $150,000 starting. You can't do that in teaching, but we're not going to have those people to run those businesses without a strong education.
Thank you. Those are great points. We do work closely with the Utah System of Higher Education and our partners. And our philosophy is that as we grow our economy, it will pay benefits, they'll produce new tax revenues that will then support education. So they really go hand in hand. The stronger the economy we have, the better education system we can have as a state. But points well taken. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Senator Plum, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You kind of come on the tail end of this, so a lot of our questions that have been bubbling up, but we'll jump around a little bit. But something that's really puzzled me, even before I was elected, was watching housing prices rise, watching accessibility rise, and that space of home ownership that's virtually disappearing for an entire group of folks, right? I mean, I put myself through school working for a family member in real estate, so I understand kind of the pressures that are in those spaces, but the fact that in Salt Lake County to find something under $500,000 is almost impossible kind of does that gag thing for me. And as I've seen the projects that get announced, and it's more so in Salt Lake County, because I know recently I saw, it was either Davis or Weber, there was a big condo complex that was being built. And I was so excited because that's ownership, right? It's maybe not the same as the single family home and the white picket fence, but that's ownership, and that's how you build generational wealth, and that's also how you build some stability, right? As you get equity in your home, you're less likely to end up homeless because you can get a second. Anyway, I go down that path.
Sure.
I would love for us as a state to explore why there are not as many condominiums being built. And when I talk to some developers, they'll say, oh, it's because of the liability that the builders can be sued. And then you talk to the title companies, and the title companies go, well, not exactly. And then you talk to someone else who says, no, Utah's actually got pretty protective laws. It's the insurance on this. So, swirling rabbit holes. I just feel like that is something that Utah perhaps should look into, is how do we help people own something? Yes, building units, building actual roofs over people's heads important, but that ownership piece, I would really like us to see if there are ways that we can, if it is a liability thing, let's see how we can address those laws. And if it's an access thing, let's see how we can help folks. If it's stimulating builders to actually not continue to own it or sell it to a big private equity firm, but to sell it to Utahns, I would love to see that be part of our going forward picture.
Thank you, Senator. I think you're spot on all of those points. And I know that the Unified Economic Opportunity Committee is really focused on this. There's the CHA, the Community Housing Affordability Task Force, and I know the governor has convened many state leaders to really try to address this, and it's at the forefront of all of the discussions I've been part of, so.
Wonderful, I'm so glad to hear it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
Ryan, for your presentation.
thank you very much.
All right, we got two last things that shouldn't take very long. Our last committee meeting, we authorized the chairs to open up some legislation, and so turn some time over to Anika to explain those. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Annika Hoydel, attorney with the Office of Legislative Research and General Counsel, and staff for this committee. So first, you should see on the screen some draft legislation that reflects the changes that were requested, as the chair said, during the June interim meeting, to extend the sunset date for the State Rehabilitation Advisory Council by 10 years. You can see that change on line 35.
Okay, thank you. Is there any questions on that? I mean, we had presentation, discussion on it last meeting, and so with this being in front of us now, if anyone would be inclined to further make a motion to accept that, or we can wait, but I want you to see the all we're doing is extending it 10 years with the presentations we had last committee. Representative Briscoe.
Do we have a chair, quorum, Mr. Chair?
We do. Let's check.
I mean, that's great news. I'd be happy to move that we approve as a committee bill State Rehabilitation Advisory Council amendments.
Okay, discussion to the motion? Seeing none, call the question then. All those in favor of moving this legislation forward as a committee bill, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Seeing none? Okay, now we got the next one. Go ahead.
All right, Annika Hoydel, committee staff. Similar to the last draft legislation in June, this committee also voted to open a bill file to extend the sunset date for the Women in the Economy Subcommittee by 5 years. That changed in 85. All right, so yes, on line 85, that's where the change is, to extend it by 5 years. Additionally, this bill makes a few technical changes, just removing references to outdated committees, funds, and acts.
Discussion to this topic. Right? Again, if you'd like to take action on that. Representative Briscoe.
I would move that we adopt Women in the Economy Subcommittee amendments as explained to us as a committee bill.
Discussion to the motion. Seeing none, all those in favor of adopting Women in the Economy Subcommittee amendments as a committee bill, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Seeing none, that passes also. Thank you for your attendance today. And one final motion. Okay, Representative Jack, thank you. Those in favor of adjourning, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? We are adjourned.